everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders, and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders. Thank you all so much for joining me for today's episode. So I realize that I'm getting this episode out late. Sometimes I do this, and it's because things get in the way of my life, and I don't often in advance record things. I know I had recorded a bunch of things for my vacation that I went on, which was super fun, which is super weird, but mostly fun. And then when I came back, I was like, oh, I don't really have one recorded in advance, and I've scheduled out my entire week, and I've scheduled over the time that I would record. So alas, here we are. So I apologize to everybody who's, likely just been sitting on pins and needles just waiting for this episode. So I apologize. I'm sure there's a number of other episodes out there of other things you can listen to. So I appreciate anybody who came back and continues to listen. So my vacation was weird in the sense that it was fun, but a buddy of mine in the middle of it said, hey, you should check the news. It's like, oh my gosh, check the news for what? I pulled out my phone, and then I looked at my phone and went, oh my gosh, Richard Simmons died? And then he said, no, you should keep scrolling. So I kept scrolling and went, oh my gosh, someone tried to assassinate the president. So obviously, whatever news source I had, they needed to flip those. Objectively speaking, someone trying to assassinate the president should be higher news than Richard Simmons. No offense to Richard Simmons. I'm really bummed. Guy was awesome. However, it should be higher news. Anyhow, my point in bringing that up, I don't really know why I'm bringing it up other than I thought that was a funny interaction. But ultimately, you know what? I'm going to take a strong stance here and say violence ain't the answer for something like this. I don't care what you think about the man. Assassinating the president is not the right answer. We have a democracy. We have a voting system. If you don't like the guy, vote him out. But don't shoot the guy. So, and I'll say that about anybody for that matter. It shouldn't be crazy to say that, but you know what? It is what it is. So, but I will say, on a lighter note, I'm going to highly recommend anybody who has access to Netflix go check out Taylor Tomlinson's stand-up. So I recently watched her most recent stand-up, and it's fantastic. And there are elements of it related to mental health, related to anxiety that I think are all fantastic, that are all very insightful, and also just very funny, very relatable, encouraging, normalizing. Last night I also watched one of her older Netflix specials, and she talks about mental health even more on that one. So I think she does great work. She does very insightful bits that kind of illustrate what it's like to have anxiety and what it's like to also, in a humorous way, come to terms with what it means to have anxiety or depression, or in her case, bipolar disorder. And I think it can be a good way for all of us to start thinking about the way that we view mental health and trying to take it lightly. Obviously, there are times that behind the scenes, I'm sure, where they are harder for her than others, but also trying to work towards developing a perspective towards ourselves and thinking about how we can use that information for a better way to live ourself and better way to live in relationship with other people. Anyways, isn't that the whole point of this podcast? Anyways, so I realize I haven't mentioned it. Hopefully everybody is not new to the podcast, but this is a question and answer based podcast. Send me in a question over at fearcastpodcast.com. You can send me a question, an audio question even, that gets to the top of the list faster by going to Instagram. I'm Fearcast Podcast over at Instagram. So I have a question that is coming from the archives from back in the day. I had this, so I went through all the emails trying to decide which ones I want to use or which one I'm going to use. And I came across this one that I had highlighted, and I don't know if old me highlighted means I've already answered this, or it means I'm not going to answer this, or it means, hey, I should answer this at some point. So I don't know. It was an old system that I promptly have forgotten. So I'm answering this again. So perhaps if I have answered this before, well, hopefully I'm consistent. If I haven't answered this before, Hey, new question, right? Also, some new things are coming. The new things are coming for the podcast. I just upgraded my software from the free GarageBand to Logic Pro, and now it feels like to make a podcast, I'm building a sandcastle with a bulldozer. This software does everything. It's a little overwhelming, but it's kind of exciting that it can kind of do everything. So hopefully, I won't get too weird with it. But I promise nothing. So it's probably going to get a little weird. And I'm going to try some new fun things. But we'll see. We'll see how lazy I get. Obviously lazy enough to not record a podcast on time. But that's a separate conversation. All right, let's get on to James's question. James says, "Hi, Kevin. I'm in the UK. My question is related to mental contamination OCD. A past experience where I was working at a company where I was given a company car to drive, which I reviled. And now they say reviled. I don't know if that means if it was misspelled to be received. I'm going to treat it as reviled. Reviled and received are two different words. All right. I reviled, which is also a great word. I reviled. And as time went by, things got worse. And I started to believe that any object which had contact with that car became contaminated. Despite getting a different car every 2 to 3 years, I couldn't face coming across items which were contaminated at work, and then I quit the job. However, there are also things at home that I labeled contaminated due to being inside the car, however briefly. For example, a laminate flooring which was put in the car from the shop to my parents' home. Also, fold-up chairs that were moved in that car and still reside at my aunt's house. I threw them out. I threw out a lot of things back then. That's what they say. I still get the same anxiety or fear from the flooring in one of my parents' rooms. And if I'm near one of the chairs, if I'm at my parent or if I'm at my aunt's house, can you help with this? It happened many years ago, but I can't find a way out of it. If I see one of the cars on the road, I still cannot comprehend how it looks. I see how ugly, old-fashioned, and just wrong it is. I can't make sense of how it was designed and how anybody would drive one or own one. Thanks." All right, James. Thank you so much for this question. So this is a to a certain degree, for some folks, a common obsession or a common obsession and a common compulsion. So sometimes we would call this wet paint, the wet paint effect, where there's this contamination from this one source that then, when touched or comes in contact with something else, like wet paint, when you touch wet paint and then touch something else with that hand, that paint then transfers to that new thing. Now, with paint, it's a little different because, in the world of paint, if you touch something that's wet paint and then you touch something else that has paint on it, and then every subsequent thing you touch has less and less and less paint. When OCD and contamination obsessions and that wet paint comes into play, another word for this might be tracking, but we'll talk about that mental compulsion in a bit. So what can sometimes happen, though, is that you have this, what was I getting on? Oh, they have this wet paint. With contamination, you touch that one central thing of contamination, and then every subsequent thing that you touch now takes on that brand new and almost the fullness of the contamination feeling or danger or discomfort or significance, whatever it is. And that can linger, as you've noticed. Now, that sometimes results in people getting wildly overwhelmed. It can result in a lot of cleaning rituals, a lot of just exhausting work. And this is where that tracking mental compulsion comes in, where someone is then trying to keep track in their mind of all the things that they touched after being in contact with whatever that primary contaminant is. They sometimes will track all the things that other people have come in contact with after touching that. And it can be overwhelming, as you can imagine. Gosh, especially I've worked with folks where there's this contaminant, but then they have kids or dogs, or sometimes they act the same, but kids and dogs or spouses or whoever in this environment, and they're trying to be cautious and trying to hold it together and not talk about whatever that thing is, the contaminant. But people are, rightly so, not thinking about it, and then contaminating everything. It's overwhelming. It can lead to avoidances or, again, just cleaning rituals and processes that drive someone bonkers. So, James, this is something that can absolutely be worked on with a therapist. So because you're in the UK, you could certainly contact a therapist out there. I know NoCD tends to work out there. There are a bunch of therapists out there that can help. However, if you're still, kind of working on this, one of the best things to do is one thing you can do is to start challenging the legitimacy of the obsession. James, let's say you are brand new to this process. It can be helpful, and again, some people disagree with me on this, it can be helpful to start thinking about what is so bad about this contamination. What is the end result of this? Is it that the contaminant is going to injure you, or is it going to injure someone vicariously through you, and you're going to be at fault because you're the conduit for that? Is it that you are going to be... Is it just a icky yucky feeling that you get when you come across that? Now, I'll reference the mastery model here in a little bit, but there's to a certain degree, if you have just kind of disgust or that gross feeling, and it's not really a feared story, it's just yucky, icky, this feels bad, that can be treated in a slightly different way, and that's with that mastery model. Now, again, that's part of challenging it, or starting to think about, what is so bad? Why is this so bad for me and not for somebody else? Where did this come from? Did this come from the car? Is it something related to the people there? Is it something related to the job itself? Is it something related to the environmental impact that car has? Later on, you referenced in your email that you feel like the car is ugly, old-fashioned, and wrong. That comment. I don't know if some of the contamination is coming from those components. If the criticism about the car is just an outpouring of the contamination obsession, and had it not been for the contamination obsession tying itself to that car and that job, you might not hate the car as much as you do. I don't know. You're not in my office, and I'm here to speculate. But then again, that's what I'm kind of good at, is kind of making stuff up. So here we are making stuff up. So, all right. So you've challenged the thought where it came from. You can challenge then, all right, what is, I like the question. What is the most logical, reasonable, and rational person? Who's the most logical, reasonable, and rational person James? What would they say to this obsession? If you were to go, hey, let's say it's your brother Dave. I don't know. Dave, so, here's the thing. So, I kind of get a little squicked out by the fact that, I had this car that was kind of funky and gross, and then things got in the cars, laminate stuff. It's over at mom's house, and I got the thing over at our aunt's house. And man, every time I see it, I kind of get a little uncomfortable and kind of get a little freaked out, and I don't really want to be around it. That seems reasonable, right, Dave? Would Dave go, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, you should avoid that stuff. Let's burn that stuff to the ground. Or would he go, I don't know, James. That sounds something that's excessive. I don't think that's something that you should be really worried about. Now, why it's helpful to check with the most logical, reasonable, rational person is that, I'm sorry to say it, sometimes when we are in the middle of our anxiety, we don't think as clearly and as straightforward and as broadly as we ought to. Maybe. Sometimes we think disastrously and catastrophically, and then worst case scenario. And all those things are not just possibilities, they are probabilities, and they are likelihoods. And the worst thing is going to happen for sure. And maybe the most logical person we know is going to say, maybe that's not entirely true. So if they were right, let's say your brother Dave was right, would you still do all the compulsions that you're doing? Or would you perhaps do something else? Now, I'm willing to bet, you already recognize that at times this obsession is out of whack. This obsession is unnecessary. You emailed me, you emailed the OCD guy, so I assume that you're not saying this makes total sense. But there's that battle in everybody where there's part of you that goes, this doesn't make any stinking sense, I don't get it, I don't want it. But there's this other voice in you that says, no, this is legit, avoid this stuff, burn the house to the ground, chop those chairs up into a wood pile. I don't know what the voice is saying. Point is, you're stuck between these two sides, and as we've said, there are two parts to everyone's brain: this very logical, reasonable, rational side, and this very fear-based side. Right? Let's go back to that old joke that I haven't mentioned in a while. The old joke is, what's the difference between someone with OCD and someone who's crazy? The person with the OCD knows they're crazy. Now, again, I use the word crazy liberally here, but the point is because, sometimes this is the words that we use to describe ourselves in the middle of our anxieties, in the middle of our unreasonableness. But that's kind of the point, is that you see both sides. The logical side that says this is not something that I should worry about. The car may be ugly. It may be ugly. There's a bunch of ugly cars out there. But the spreading of contamination to these things doesn't add up. But then the fear, the emotional part of this is the problem. Now, I've often said that OCD isn't really a thought problem. It is a feeling problem. You, James, have talked yourself out of this obsession, I'm going to say a bajillion times. You've talked yourself out of it and said this doesn't make any stinking sense. And yet, I bet you still avoid those things, right? Because it's not the logic part of it. It is that what if and the feeling that you get. If you just had the thought without the feeling, you probably wouldn't care. You'd just keep on moving. Wouldn't we all? But it's that feeling that's there that's very convincing that there's something that ought to be done in that case. Okay. So here's what we ultimately need to do is we need to then face that fear. We need to say this feeling, the fear and the feeling subsequent to that fear or indicative of or pointing to or resulting from that fear is unreasonable and is temporary and is not founded in something tangible, logical, reasonable, rational, is founded in an irrational, distorted thought. Or is back to the mastery model. And I've written on this and I'll give a little summary of it, but you can also just say it's founded in just ickiness. My body perceives this as icky. So, and that's all there is. So when it comes to exposure and response prevention, what we want to do is, again, to face your fear, exposure, with response prevention is resisting compulsion. I realize the response prevention or ritual prevention can be confusing as a word, but it's essentially saying I'm going to expose myself without doing my compulsion. I'm going to show myself that I can be around this feeling and around this object without giving into it. And that feeling that comes up as a result of it doesn't need to be dealt with through compulsion. The feeling will dissipate all on its own, whether I do even if I do nothing. And I'll say, especially if you do nothing. Not ruminate about it, not check on it, not think about how awful and terrible it is, not sitting and hoping that that feeling goes away, not sitting and saying, go away, go away, go away, go away. It's saying, I'm going to be in this and I'm going to have that feeling and I'm not going to do anything about it and I'm going to let it be. It's giving ourselves the opportunity to let our brain get bored with the thought and our brain to also get bored with sending out danger messages and saying that something ought to be done. And you saying there isn't anything that needs to be done, brain. All there needs to be done is to sit here in this chair or to hang out on the floor and to wait for that stupid feeling to go away. Now, you can do that intentionally. Now, a couple of ways you can go about doing this. I think any way that you do this is possible. Now, you could just do the bare bones of this and practice response prevention. If you're to do anything, response prevention is the first thing you ought to do. It is go to your parents' house. And if there's something in the other room, go get it. Go get it, leave, and then spend as little time ruminating about it, tracking, thinking about what you just touched, playing through stories about that job, playing through stories about that car, fighting with that feeling and telling yourself you shouldn't feel that feeling. It's to say you're going to do nothing with it because it doesn't matter. And you're going to move on, and you're going to shift your focus to anything. Making tea for mom, mum, I think that's the right way to pronounce it in the UK. And you're just going to get on with your day. Now, that's one way to do it, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. You could be a little bit more aggressive with it and say, you know what, I'm going to go into that room and I'm going to lie down on the floor and put my whole body on that floor and I'm going to sit there until that feeling drops by at least half, and then I'll get up and I'll get out and I'll come back the next day, have some tea, and then hang out on the floor. And you're going to explain to mom, trust me, some internet person told me to do this, someone with a podcast told me to do this, so it's got to be legit. And go give it a try and just wait for that anxiety and that feeling to drop by half and then get on with your day. Now, up from that, contaminate everything. I like this one a lot. This one is letting yourself not let yourself only live in a world that is contaminated. Because if it's contaminated, there's no choice but to live in that world. There isn't a safe place for you. There isn't a place of reprieve. And there also then isn't this tracking that you have to do to evaluate what's more contaminated than other things and what's kind of safe. And this thing was touched 2 weeks ago, but this one over here is fresher because it's been 2 days. So I can touch the other. It's too much work. Contaminate everything and then go on with your day. And again, spending as little time fighting with, reducing, shifting, reframing, etc. To say this is what life is now. It is in a world that feels contaminated, and then that's it. We'll see what happens. If there is that feared story that, oh no, I'm going to hurt somebody, well, we can test that out, right? If the worry is I'm going to touch this and I go touch my mom and my mom dies, you can test that. Now here's the thing. If the floor is that contaminated that you immediately touch your mom and she dies, all right, first off, if that happens, that sucks and I'm sorry. The second part is the floor really that contaminated? I want you to touch then a bunch of people. And I want you to see if you touch all those people. I'm pretty certain that if that floor was so contaminated that you're then touching everybody and they're all dying, that the police would want to know that that floor is really poisonous. And then secondly, the medical community is definitely going to want to know how you are not dying by touching that floor and then touching all these people. And they're dying. That doesn't make any sense. What superpowers do you have, James? What are you hiding from us? That's what we all want to know. Anyways, we'll get to that later. So the other thing is the mastery model. Mastery model is that you kind of do it in reverse. We want to say, James, what would it take for you? What compulsions would be required for you to sit in the chair, sit on the floor of those contaminated things, or to be in that car, to rent that car and drive that again? All right. We want to be creating this. And this is developed by Rich Gallagher. He's got an upcoming book. It's going to be fantastic. And oddly enough, it's specific to contamination obsessions. He focuses, to no surprise, on his mastery model. So buckle up. There's going to be a lot of this. So the way it would work is that you think about what would it take for you to be able to do those things and interact with those things effectively. Do those things. Start there. The point is to be interacting with that room, not avoiding, facing your fear, facing the place, even though you're doing compulsions. It may be washing. It may be, maybe you having to wear like 2 socks, or you wear shoes in your aunt's house and then you take your shoes off and I don't know, something to that effect. But the point is you do that for a little bit. And then you think about what compulsion would you bring back slowly? So that you're starting with function and showing that you can be in that room and in that chair and in that car, and then slowly start to pull back on compulsions. So you're still having to face your fear and you're still having to do them without compulsion. That's the end result for both of these. But one, you're starting with a lower interaction but no compulsions, or fewer compulsions. The other, you're starting with full interaction but also full compulsion. But again, slowly pulling down to eventually being able to have full contact with these places and these objects and items without compulsion. That's your end result. So however you feel you need to get there, James, do that. Now, a therapist can help work with you on that and can experiment with both of these approaches, and both of them are completely feasible and workable. It's just, which one are you going to do? It comes back to the old saying, what's the best exercise out there? And the answer is the one that you'll do. So which one of these are you going to try, James? So I know there's other things that I could have identified or other things we could have talked about in this, but I'll leave it here. So James, thank you so much for this question. This has been a fun one. I don't get a lot of contamination questions, and I wish I got more. This podcast is very full of hyper-awareness and relationship OCD and sexual orientation OCD. And don't get me wrong, those are things we love talking about. But man, contamination is also great. If you have scroop questions, moral or religious, if you have existential questions, we haven't gotten those in a long time, I want to hear them. So send in your questions, send in your audio questions. Again, if you want the question gone to the top of the list, send that. Now, if I missed something, send it in. James, if you're still working on this or you have found freedom from it, let me know. Shoot me an email and follow up on that. So again, thank you so much, James, for your question. Thank you for listening to the Fearcast. If you would like your question answered on a future episode, please click on the Submit a Question link at fearcastpodcast.com. If you would like your question answered sooner, please send me a recording of your question to questions@fearcastpodcast.com or by sending me an audio message through Instagram by DMing me at fearcastpodcast on Instagram. If you like the Fearcast, please write a review on your podcast platform of choice. Please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, please go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.